Oh, we got some screaming fans out there, but listen. Oh, wait, hold on.
Their love was forbidden.
At 81, Diana Ross finally tells the truth about Michael Jackson. Hook, midnight to 0:30. In 1968, a 9-year-old boy from Gary, Indiana stood backstage at a Motown showcase, staring at the most famous woman in music. Nearly 60 years later, that boy is gone, but the woman is still here, and at 81 years old, Diana Ross is still one of the only people alive who truly knew Michael Jackson before the world turned him into a myth. This isn't a story about secret romance or hidden confessions. It's something rarer, the real, documented history of two Motown legends whose bond shaped the king of pop long before he ever wore the crown. Stick around, because the true story is more interesting than the rumors. 1 o'clock, the meeting that started it all. The story most people know begins with a single, carefully staged moment. In 1969, Motown released an album called Diana Ross Presents the Jackson 5, and the cover story was simple. Ross had discovered the group and personally brought them to Motown founder Berry Gordy. It was a compelling narrative, and it stuck. For decades, fans repeated it as fact. But the real history is a little different, and honestly, a little more interesting. Berry Gordy built Motown as much on mythology as on music, and the Diana discovered them story was largely his invention, a way to link an established superstar to a promising new act. Music historians and several people close to Motown at the time, including executive Suzanne DePass and singer Gladys Knight, have said the Jackson 5 were actually brought to Gordy's attention through other channels within the Motown organization. Russ didn't discover them, but she did something arguably more important. Once they arrived, she took an active interest in them, especially in Michael. That distinction matters, because it tells you something true about who Diana Ross actually was to Michael Jackson. She wasn't a talent scout who stumbled onto a prodigy. She was an established star who chose to invest time in a child performer, at a moment in her own career when she had every reason not to bother. 2:15, a child of Motown. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what Michael Jackson's childhood actually looked like. He was 9 years old when the Jackson 5 signed with Motown, already performing for hours a day, already under the intense pressure of his father Joseph's ambitions for the group. Motown itself was a machine, brilliant, but relentless. Young performers were expected to rehearse constantly, present themselves a certain way, and deliver hit after hit. Into that environment stepped Diana Ross, who was already Motown's brightest star, as the lead singer of the Supremes. She was 24 years old when the Jackson 5 signed, a full generation ahead of Michael in experience and fame. By most accounts from people who were present in Motown's orbit at the time, including biographers who interviewed Motown staff and family members, Ross took a genuine interest in the group, and especially in Michael's development as a performer. She reportedly spent time with him, watched his stage presence evolve, and became something of an example for how a young black artist could carry themselves with polish and command in an industry that wasn't always kind to its youngest stars. Michael himself talked about this influence throughout his life. In interviews across decades, he described watching Ross rehearse, studying how she moved on stage, and treating her as something close to a professional blueprint. This wasn't a secret. It was one of the more openly discussed relationships of his career, an older star mentoring a rising one, in an industry built on exactly that kind of apprenticeship. 4 o'clock, what mentor actually meant. It's worth pausing here, because mentor can sound like a vague, sentimental word, and in this case it wasn't. Ross's influence on Michael Jackson was specific and traceable. Watch footage of Diana Ross performing with the Supremes in the mid-1960s, and then watch Michael Jackson's stage presence in the early 1970s, the extended arm gestures, the way he commanded space on a stage built for a much bigger performer, the theatrical stillness before a big note. Michael openly credited Ross as one of his primary influences in shaping that persona. He wasn't shy about it. He talked about her poise, her ability to hold a room's attention without needing to move, and her instinct for turning a performance into a complete visual experience rather than just a song. This is also backed up by Motown's own internal culture at the time. The label ran what employees nicknamed Motown University, a set of in-house classes on stagecraft, poise, and public presentation for its young artists, run partly by people close to Ross and other established stars. Michael, still a child, absorbed an enormous amount from watching seasoned performers like Ross navigate exactly the kind of stardom he was about to inherit. 05:30. The Wiz, 1978. The clearest, most well-documented chapter of their relationship is The Wiz, the 1978 film adaptation of The Wizard of Oz, where Russ starred as Dorothy, and a 20-year-old Michael Jackson played the Scarecrow. By this point, Michael was no longer the child star of the Jackson 5. He was on the edge of a transformation, working to define an identity separate from his family's group and separate from the version of himself Motown had built years earlier. Filming The Wiz put him and Russ in extended, day-to-day proximity for the first time since his childhood. Not brief backstage encounters, but months of actual collaborative work. The film itself was not a commercial success. Critics at the time were mixed on it, and it underperformed at the box office. But for Michael personally, the production is widely reported to have been significant. It was during The Wiz that he first met Quincy Jones, who served as the film's musical supervisor. A meeting that would go on to define the next decade of Michael's career, leading directly to Off the Wall, Thriller, and Bad. Russ, in a real and traceable way, was part of the environment that put those two men in the same room. Beyond the professional connection, people involved in the production have described Russ and Jackson as close and comfortable with each other on set, consistent with a friendship that had already spanned about a decade by that point. It was a working relationship between two Motown veterans, one of whom was still finding his footing as an adult artist for the first time. A 7 o'clock, a public, lifelong friendship. What's remarkable about the Russ-Jackson relationship isn't that it was secret. It's that it played out largely in public, for nearly the entire span of both of their careers, and it never really stopped. Michael frequently spoke about Russ with open admiration in interviews throughout the 1980s and 1990s. He appeared at events honoring her. He wrote and spoke about her influence in his own memoir, Moonwalk, describing his early fascination with her as a performer and crediting her as one of the artists who shaped his sense of what stardom could look like. The two appeared together at award shows, industry tributes, and Motown anniversary specials for decades, their friendship treated by the industry as one of its more enduring bonds. That friendship was tested by tabloid speculation for years, rumors of romance, engagement claims from unauthorized biographies, and various sensational stories that neither Russ nor Jackson ever substantively confirmed. Some of these claims, particularly those drawn from J. Randy Taraborelli's unauthorized biographies of both stars, have circulated for decades without independent confirmation from Russ or Jackson themselves. It's worth being upfront about that distinction. There's a real, documented professional and personal friendship here, and then there's a layer of tabloid mythology that grew up around it, which is a different thing entirely. 0845, 2009 and after. When Michael Jackson died in June 2009, Diana Ross was one of the first major figures from his life to speak publicly, and her tribute was notably personal rather than performative. She released a statement expressing profound grief and recalling their decades-long friendship, and she was present at events honoring his memory in the years that followed. Katherine Jackson, Michael's mother, has spoken about Russ's closeness to the family over the years, and Russ has periodically appeared in documentaries and retrospectives about Michael's life and Motown's history, generally speaking about him with warmth and protectiveness rather than offering dramatic new revelations. In the years since, Russ has largely maintained the same posture she held for most of her life regarding Michael. She speaks about him as a friend and a talent she watched grow from a child into one of the most famous performers on earth, without feeding the more sensational rumors that have followed their relationship online. 945. Two different pods from the same label. It's also worth understanding how differently Russ and Jackson's careers unfolded after their early years together, because it shapes how their relationship looked from the outside as decades passed. Russ left the Supremes in 1970 to launch a solo career, going on to become one of the most successful solo artists to come out of Motown, with hits like Ain't No Mountain High Enough, Touch Me in the Morning, and later Upside Down and I'm Coming Out. She also moved into film, earning an Academy Award nomination for her role as Billie Holiday in Lady Sings the Blues in 1972, a role that, notably, Berry Gordy fought to get her, over resistance from studio executives who doubted a Motown singer could carry a dramatic film. By the time she and Michael co-starred in The Wiz 6 years later, she was already an established film actress as well as a music icon. Michael, meanwhile, was still working through the transition from child star to adult artist, a transition that many former child performers never successfully make. The Jackson 5 left Motown for Epic Records in 1975 amid contract disputes, becoming the Jacksons, and Michael spent much of the mid-1970s figuring out what his career would look like outside the group and outside the Motown machine that had raised him. The Wiz came at exactly that inflection point. So when the two of them stood on set together in 1977 and 1978, they weren't peers in the way they had been a decade earlier. Russ was the seasoned veteran. Michael was a promising talent, still trying to prove he could carry something on his own. That dynamic, an established star extending a hand to someone still finding his footing, is consistent with how people who worked with them at the time have described the relationship. 11:15. What Michael said, in his own words. Rather than relying on second-hand claims, it's worth looking at what Michael Jackson actually said about Diana Ross across his public life, because he talked about her more openly than almost anyone else from his childhood. In his 1988 memoir Moonwalk, Jackson wrote at length about his early admiration for Ross, describing the way he studied her performances and crediting her stage presence as something he actively tried to learn from as a young performer. He described feeling that she represented a kind of glamour and control that he wanted to bring into his own act. This wasn't a passing mention. Russ appears as one of the most significant influences he names from his Motown years, alongside performers